Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Focal Points. Today, our special guest is McCullough Foundation scholar Nathaniel Mead, Dr. Nathaniel Mead. Actually, he just received his PhD, and he is a former NIH editor and writer, and he has over 50 peer reviewed publications under his belt. And we're going to talk about the recent landmark analysis where Dr. Mead is the first author. I'm an author on there as well. Dr. Peter McCullough, William Mackis, Kirk Milholm, Jessica Rose. We're all authors on this massive paper that absolutely shatters the myths perpetuated by public health agencies that COVID-19 vaccine-induced myocarditis was mild and transient. Absolute nonsense, and it's completely debunked in our recent study here. So, Dr. Mead, why don't you give us just a brief background about yourself, and let's dive into the study.
Well, thank you, Nick. I'm a nutritional epidemiologist by training, went through the doctoral program at UNC School of Public Health, and had prior training in the biological sciences, science education. I taught high school biology for some years. And then got into science writing and eventually worked for the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, writing papers, and I became very good at synthesizing information, putting complex topics together. And I think having that background in education also gave me sort of a facility with communicating complex ideas and distilling it down for the public. So that's the gist of it. And
well, I'll tell you, your peer-reviewed manuscripts are the best and biggest I've ever seen. I mean, really, 300 and over 340 references in one paper. It's like a book, right? And so we really are happy at the McCullough Foundation to have you on our team.
Thank you. Well, it's been an honor to work with Peter McCullough and with you and the rest of the team. I feel really excited about just the power of the written word at this point, because I think we're seeing a lot of changes occurring as a result of revealing these, what are essentially very complex ideas in science that people often aren't able to decipher, because of the extensive amount of flawed research that's out there, which has created a very distorted perception of what's actually going on. And that's why the myocarditis paper was so exciting for me to work on and to jump into, because I think that's a great example of the distortions that we've seen.
Yes. Well, I just opened up this paper here, and so take us through what happened. What did we look at in this paper? What did we find, and just how nonsense was the public health messaging on vaccine-induced heart damage?
Well, first of all, it is a long paper, so you and I don't have time to go through the whole thing, but we will hit the highlights. And just stop me at any point if you want to interject something or if you feel that we need to clarify something. But I think, this was an unusual review because, as I said, there is a lot of bad science that's connected to myocarditis. And a lot of that is because of conflicts of interest and people not wanting to reveal the truth, which is that these COVID-19 mRNA injections have been damaging a lot of hearts and causing inflammation in the heart, which is what myocarditis is, and causing the chest pain and other symptoms. So the paper is really an unusual synthesis of, I say unusual because it was selective. When I dove into this initially, during my initial conversations with Dr. McCullough, I came to this realization that I was going to have to choose paper studies that were really giving us important information that had to be paid attention to on a precautionary basis, applying the precautionary principle. And also, we wanted to make sure that we didn't use studies that were flawed or based on incorrect assumptions. And so it was a synthesis of the research. And we also looked at what I initially called the three myths, which Dr. McCullough asked me to reframe as the three misconceptions. And what's funny about that is that so many commentators have since just automatically called them myths, including you, I think, which is fine because that was the original intention. But in order to get it published, we decided to call them the three misconceptions. So
yeah, we know a lot of peer reviewers are very sensitive, and so
yes,
yeah,
yes.
right. But yeah, obviously they are myths, right? We know for sure. I mean, there's so much evidence. They're clearly myths, so we can say it. But yeah, when we try and get papers published, we got to stick with.
We got to be careful. We want to sound a little bit conservative in our way of thinking, and even though there are a lot of papers out there that have talked about myths openly. But this is such a charged topic, so politically charged and emotionally charged that a lot of people are not comfortable with, a lot of scientists and academics in particular are not comfortable with using that kind of language. So the three misconceptions or myths are, first of all, that the coronavirus infections have caused more cases of myocarditis than the COVID-19 mRNA injections. And that is the core myth, I would say. That is the core myth because the other ones kind of are offshoots of that. And we showed that that's certainly incorrect, that in fact, it was the COVID-19 mRNA shots that were causing more myocarditis cases. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those issues. The second one was that the mRNA vaccine-induced myocarditis is usually mild, transient, or rare with no long-term sequelae. And the third is that the risk-benefit calculus favors continued use of these products despite all the evidence. And that's probably the most important one from a regulatory point of view. And we also dismantled that myth. So what I'll do is I'll just go through the paper, and I highlighted a few things. I don't know how well you can see it on your end, but I highlighted a few things. The opening paragraph, I felt it was important to just go right to the fact that people are experiencing this issue. It's not myocarditis can be very superficial in its presentation. It can be, a subclinical entity where you don't even see these symptoms outwardly, except in a very mild way. But the most typical presentation is discomfort in the chest area and tightness, pain. And I first became aware of this in 2021. My neighbor was a young man in his late 30s, had two of the shots, the first two for the primary series, and came home from work one day and was just clutching his chest. I came home and I saw him because he was my next door neighbor. He was sitting in front of his house. And so I know that this is I witnessed it firsthand. And he had this pain lasting for a while. I can't remember exactly how long, but in his case, it eventually subsided, and he decided he never went to the doctor. He never reported it. And we know that it was related because he had just recently had the shot, and he himself knew that it was connected. And so, but that raises an interesting point, is that so many of these cases were not reported. And so that is a unfortunate reality, is that we don't really know the true extent of myocarditis in the population. And then the second issue that I highlighted to the right there is that in the decades leading up to the pandemic, vaccination had already been recognized as a potential cause of myocarditis, associated with the smallpox and anthrax vaccines, which are both related to military use, which I find fascinating. Did you want to comment on that, or I saw you moving toward your mic?
Well, I mean, we know that a lot of the stuff regarding mRNA shots has been associated with military operations and military programs.
Yeah, right. So it's interesting that we now know that the COVID mRNA vaccines are also very much connected to military programs, and the funding, a lot of the funding, especially for the Moderna vaccine, came from the military, came from the Department of Defense and DARPA. So it's
P3.
Yep. So it's getting darker, the situation. Yeah. We look at that the fact that the research came from that, and then now the revelations that have come out about the origins of the virus, that it was indeed a lab leak, whether intentional or not, as part of a biodefense research project. So that's a very serious background context. Now, I'm just going to hit a few highlights. I mentioned the South Korea study that showed a 620% increased risk of myocarditis, and 175% increased risk of pericarditis, which is inflammation of the pericardium, the sac around the heart. And so there was that kind of, and by the way, those two usually coexist, those conditions. That study, I know you've reported on it at one point in your Substack. I'm pretty sure you did. And, it's an example of one of many, but South Korea was an extensively vaccinated country. And so, countries that have these high vaccination rates are offering some of the best data. Japan is actually another one where we've seen a lot of very important data coming out. And then the Nordic countries, which we covered in this paper as well, providing a lot of great data.
It appears countries other than the United States are doing much better research when it comes to the harms of these shots, right? I mean, there's not many come out of America, right? Or at least not as many as, say, for example, the Asian countries or some of the European countries, or even Africa, right? I mean, there's some stuff coming out of Africa, but
and generally speaking, you can tell, and you probably know this, it's a little bit disturbing, but you can tell almost immediately when you look at the acknowledgments and the conflicts of interest statements at the end of a paper, whether it's a good paper or not. It's like a basic screening technique. And if the paper was supported by the CDC or by what Dr. McCullough has called a biopharma complex, any of those entities that are within that, which are, like the Gates Foundation, Gavi, of course, Pfizer and Moderna, and so when you look at the credits at the end, or I call them credits, those guys are often a dead giveaway about how bad the research is, and a lot of that does come out of the United States. Unfortunately, it's very sad to see. In other words, you'll see researchers who look very respectable, from Johns Hopkins or other universities, and then you find out when you look more closely that they're all in the pocket of the pharmaceutical industry. So the diagnosis aspects I mentioned in the paper, just it's important to realize that, of course, you want to confirm the myocarditis, and that's what adjudication involves, where you would look at things like, in addition to the outward symptoms, you would look at cardiac troponin levels, which would indicate potential myocardial injury. And then you could also include echocardiography, cardiac MRIs, and endomyocardial biopsies. These are all part of the whole picture of really nailing down a diagnosis. And I'm moving kind of quickly because I know we want to make sure we have some time at the end to just pull it all together. But I identified, I mentioned here scrolling a little too fast, the CDC's vSafe system. It's very interesting. This is a voluntary system that uses a cell phone, where you report things after you've had the shot, you report symptoms, and yet they did not include chest pain as an option for symptom reporting. And that, to me, when you think about the recent U.S. Senate hearing on the corruption of science, to me, that is a symptom of the corruption, because this is the CDC. They knew that chest pain was the number one symptom for myocarditis, and that myocarditis was among the list of most anticipated adverse events that would come along with these shots. So that did not make any sense at all. And in fact, it smacks of corruption to me.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the side effect or symptom that is expected to be one of the highest reported symptoms is explicitly not included as an option. I mean, that's just ridiculous. That's something a criminal syndicate would do, right? That's not something that a public health agency should do.
It is just, it's absurd. And that the fact that they somehow got away with it, I know Aaron Siri has done a lot of great work with the vSafe data, but right, I think that's what he's mainly been working with, the lawyer, but and he testified at the U.S. Senate hearing. But I think, that it's one example of many where we've seen various tactics used to underreport what's actually going on, or in this case, not report at all.
Yeah.
So then I mentioned that the signal was based on various estimates of vaccine-related myocarditis, approximately 1 to 3 per 100,000 recipients of the mRNA shots. And that led to the FDA issuing a warning about myocarditis associated with both the Pfizer and Moderna products. Now, then we talked about susceptibility factors, and this is very important. We talked about age and gender. Men under age 40 had a heightened risk of acute myocarditis following the mRNA shots. The risk appearing to be greatest, very substantially higher for adolescent men aged 12 to 24. And many studies showed that. So the reason that's so important is that if you don't stratify according to age and gender, or stratify by age and gender for in observational studies, you're going to miss the target groups that are most likely suffering from myocarditis. And many of the large observational studies would report their risks based not on stratified analyses or poorly stratified. It was, they'd have a few, 1 or 2 factors were stratified, but but often they would not do what needed to be done to get a good number. And a clear outcome had to be based on stratification by age and gender at the very least. And of course, observational studies are always going to be underreporting. It's not like
Right.
a randomized trial, but in the randomized trials, as we discussed in the lessons learned review, there was tremendous underreporting as well, and loss to follow up. Hundreds of people lost to follow up, which we have no idea. Did they die? Did they, succumb in some way to the effects? In the Pfizer trial, it was like 400 people approximately, which is amazing to think of the loss there. So loss of data that was necessary for coming to a good conclusion. Then we looked at chronic inflammation. And, this is a factor that I think is often overlooked, but, mRNA vaccines may amplify any of the cardiac adverse events in individuals with chronic inflammatory conditions. And that could include obesity, diabetes, arthritis, and a lot more. And then finally, genetic factors. And I thought, this statement that seemed important, and I know that the team liked it, was that it may be possible to construct a comprehensive genomic panel that could help predict increased predictability of myocarditis and other adverse events linked with the mRNA shots. So I think that's something that, of course, ideally, if you were able to do a really good study, you would want to look at genetic factors that predispose people as well. Of course, that's very expensive to do, and you're not going to see it in an observational study. It would have to be a small perspective study. And that's actually the best research that we've seen, as you know, is the small perspective studies that looked at cardiac function and monitored that over time. Now, this table, which you assisted me with greatly, and we had a good collaboration on this table, we laid out really the more severe risks that were seen in these studies, because we wanted to make sure that not to sensationalize, but to identify the groups that were most likely getting hit the hardest, which of course were the young males. And so that's why we highlighted those in this table and called them the key findings. Because, of course, we could have mentioned all the findings which were reported in the abstract, or at the top of the main findings, but these subgroups are the ones that we're most concerned about. And a big reason that we did this paper was so that those groups would not be overlooked. So I think people can scroll through themselves, but, like, for example, the Buchan et al. Study, approximately 30 myocarditis cases per 100,000 in males. So remember that the CDC reported a signal based on 1 to 3 cases per 100,000. So this was approximately 30 when you look at males in an observational study that's already underreporting. And then we have 37.7 per 100,000 for young males aged 12 to 17 in the Scharf et al. Study for the Pfizer shot. And that's after dose 2. And 53.7, approximately 54 cases per 100,000 in males 18 to 24 after dose 2 18 to 24. So the slightly older age group actually showed even higher rate there. Probably the most important study, I think, was the Karlstad study. It was a very nicely done observational study in Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. And they found 5.5 excess events per 100,000 after the second dose of Pfizer and 18.4 excess events per 100,000 in the Moderna group after the second dose for ages 16 to 24 in male. Now, that's again showing another aspect to this is that we did see more. Generally, I think the research is stronger in terms of when you look at the manufacturing source, you saw that the Moderna shot led to more severe adverse events.
Which is weird given that recent study with Joe Ladapo finding that Pfizer increased all-cause mortality 36% compared to Moderna recipients. So it's like we see this conflicting kind of data where it appears that what Moderna caused more heart damage, more myocarditis, but for some reason Pfizer was linked to more mortality. Do you have any comment on that? Like why? What could explain that?
I think first you have to be careful because Ladapo was looking at a broad range of serious adverse events. We're just looking at myocarditis,
right.
And so I don't know. I haven't actually looked at his data to see what he's saying about myocarditis per se, but it also depends on the population and where, like in Florida, are people disproportionately getting the Pfizer shots? But I think in general, myocarditis as a short-term outcome is going to show up more often with Moderna.
Right. Yeah, we clearly see it, right? We clearly
as a short term. Yeah. And I think this is the other point, Nick, is that maybe Pfizer would show more heart-related problems over the long term.
Right.
And so we need to look at that because we do know that those DNA contaminants, the process-related impurities, are very high in the Pfizer shots. And maybe that translates into more heart-related issues that are connected to that contaminant issue. But yeah, I would be very interested to see that. But it's a good question. So looking at dose number, manufacturer, and batch variability, I think the paper does a solid job addressing those. And we do know that the more doses you get, the more myocarditis you see. Like, for example, the Full-Trans study, 4,900 adverse events in adolescents based on pharmacovigilance data from 148 countries. And so the second dose was associated with a 5-fold increase in the reporting odds of myocarditis or pericarditis compared to the first dose. So that's substantial. And then the Gauss study, I think, is a really interesting study. 59 million people showed a 4-fold increase in the risk for those who received the second dose compared to the first dose, compared to those who received the first dose. And Moderna's in that study was twice the risk compared to Pfizer. So again, it does seem that for myocarditis, at least for the short term, we see that kind of effect. Now, let's see. So, and then we looked at the fact that the mRNA, the Moderna product has a much higher concentration of mRNA, which is the modified synthetic mRNA, about 3 times as much as Pfizer. And And then interestingly, in the third dose, they go back down to half, and you see a drop in the incidence related to that. So that suggests, again, a dose response effect. And then the impact of successive doses is fairly clear and seems to be related to the I'd say immunological disruption, but we're still trying to get a better handle on that. It could also be related to the process-related impurities or DNA contaminants. And then, okay, I'm just going to scroll down through. Let's see, what page are we on? Oh, shoot, we're only on page 5. Okay.
Go. Let's see. Maybe we'll move to the key myths.
Let's do that. So
Yeah.
I'll just say briefly that we looked at warning signs from diverse sources, and this is important because, we looked at the trial data, and there were some pretty strong things that were shown in the trials. So I urge people to look at our epidemiological overview, the autopsy data that you covered so nicely in your systematic review, military data, U.S. life insurance data, which is very, very compelling. The U.S.
You got everything in this paper. It's literally like everything you could even think of. So I really do urge everybody watching this to please go check this paper out.
Yeah.
It will be, the link will be in the Substack post of this interview. And, I'll put it in the comments as well. But yeah, everybody, please check this out. I mean, it truly is a database or a dictionary of these harms.
Thank you. Yeah, now you can see I just blew up the this one life insurance graph. You see it's showing up there, right? Yeah. And what you can see is that for 2021, there was a clear excess mortality for cardiovascular disease. So cardiovascular disease mortality relative to baseline jumped substantially in 2021. And it's worse. It's really worse overall than 2022. You can see there's a lot more right here for the US population above 110%, but also overall the area. And so it's quite stunning to realize that happened after the vaccines were rolled out, and to see that kind of thing. All right, I'll come back down to normal size here. Okay. And yeah, I do urge, I agree with you. And the VAERS analyses were really wonderful that Dr. Jessica Rose contributed, and her discussions were superb. And I'm sure people who are watching this are familiar with her work, but it's quite striking to look at that. And then we looked at case report data and sudden deaths in athletes. Okay, so myth number 1, that the coronavirus infections caused more myocarditis than the COVID vaccinations. Now, this is a complex discussion. I'm not going to go into the technicalities here because I dove in very deep epidemiologically, as you know, and you're an epidemiologist, so you can appreciate the level of precision that went into looking at some of these studies. It was kind of like excavating these studies and looking at, okay, what did they really show, and what were some of the real problems with the way the data was presented, and then or not even being reported even within the published research. So I'm just going to quickly read through this set of explanations, and then we can briefly comment. So hospitalized COVID patients with cardiovascular conditions and high troponin levels triggered clusters of ICD codes. That's International Classification of Diseases. Those are the codes that are used in the hospital to keep track of disease rates and what's happening in terms of diagnoses. So again, hospitalized COVID patients with cardiovascular diseases or conditions had high troponin levels would trigger these ICD codes, and with the troponin testing enabling a codified data to then be analyzed and reported as COVID-related myocarditis. Okay, so that's a huge one because those cases were just assumed to be COVID-related and they were counted that way. Okay, then the second one is over-reliance on data from hospitalized COVID cases without clinical confirmation of the myocardial inflammation. All right, so those cases that were counted and looked at, recorded with the ICD codes, were not actually verified. They were not adjudicated. And then the third, lack of autopsy confirmation for people who died afterwards. Very important. Differences in how myocarditis incidence is calculated in relation to the coronavirus infection versus the mRNA shots, resulting in an underestimation of the latter. And then finally, a failure to consider that the SARS-CoV-2 infection is a breakthrough infection, which is by definition somebody who was previously vaccinated. So it's superimposed on a baseline of failed COVID-19 vaccination. I'm going to come back to that one in particular because I think it's very important. So these are the basic reasons that that people had this misconception, and we go into detail on each one of these, explaining, that again, the problem of ICD codes linked with the high troponin levels, incidental to many COVID-19 hospitalizations. So those are high troponin levels simply because those people had cardiovascular conditions that were going to trigger high troponin levels anyway. Okay. So
right, they just claimed that high troponin meant myocarditis when clearly that's not the case.
Exactly. And here in this quote, I'm highlighting the fact that the US government's financial incentives helped fuel this misconception, because the CARES Act, which is Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, was giving huge amounts of money to hospitals to report COVID cases. So they're incentivizing doctors to basically be dishonest because, these doctors, they had no problem calling it a COVID case even without a positive PCR, because the CDC allowed that. They said, you don't have to have a positive PCR to call it a COVID case. If the symptoms look like COVID, you can call it COVID. And so those cases were overcounted in vast numbers, creating a perception that the COVID was causing the myocarditis. Now, let's see here. All right, just looking at what I highlighted because I know we have limited time. And I mentioned the lack of stratification before. The current ACIP head, the Vaccine Safety Committee head, which Vinay Prasad, co-authored this paper that I think was very helpful in pointing out the importance of stratification. So we want to give a shout out to him for that paper. And basic point being that proper stratification of the data consistently results in reports of higher myocarditis incidence among younger males, with few exceptions. And so that's a kind of a litmus test for a good paper. And then variable precision in calculations of myocarditis depend on the type of exposure. So for example, if you're looking at, I think this quote actually does summarize it beautifully, that myocarditis incidence following the COVID vaccination is relatively straightforward to estimate, as both number of cases and number of mRNA doses are well documented. But determining the myocarditis incidence following the infection is much more challenging, less reliable, because the total number of infections remains unknown and cannot be accurately calculated, regardless of the number of PCR tests conducted. And so we laid out the whole reasoning behind that statement, which I think is very important. And then subclinical myocarditis results in undercounting. That, of course, makes sense, right? If you can't see it, then you're going to undercount it. And then flawed methodologies and misreporting have distorted the infection versus injection argument. And one of the most profound examples of this was the study by Patone et al., Patone and colleagues in the UK. And so I gave that a lot of attention in this paper because it's often cited as an example of, actually showing that young men did have much more vaccine-related myocarditis and infection-related myocarditis. But what's interesting is that their overall conclusion was that the infection still caused a lot more myocarditis. And when you look carefully at their methodology, you realize it was extremely flawed. Like, for example, they didn't even include the day zero post-injection myocarditis, even though they had 54 cases in there. So it's like, they deliberately omitted certain data in order to come up with that bogus conclusion. So
right, yeah, and that's the problem with a lot of those studies that claim more myocarditis with infection, just completely flawed, and they already basically have predetermined conclusions before they even start the study with these ridiculous methodologies. And so again, that's another reason why this study here is so important, is that it would lay it all out exactly why the nonsense is false. And honestly, I just want to say this. If any regulator reads this entire paper, one would expect them to say, well, hold on a minute, the risks do far outweigh the benefits, because it's so obvious, based on all this evidence. And so, let's move. Let's go on here.
I'll just mention a couple others, I encourage people, if you want a really good sort of in-depth analysis of the Patone study, please look at the paper. I'm not going to go into it all right now because it would take a whole hour. But the Stowe paper is another one. Also, basically the same population, UK population. And what was interesting about this paper is at the very bottom of table 1, I find this very striking. This is actually pointed out to me by Paul Borden at University of Virginia. The very striking, basically, statistical confession here, even though it's not, we're not taking into account confounders. So this is sort of a crude statement, but when you look at the two different measures of myocarditis risk per 100,000, you can clearly see I'm going to blow it up a little bit for you. You can clearly see the unvaccinated. Okay, so this is unvaccinated, right? Look at the numbers here. 2.03, right? Versus, okay, for the Moderna shot per 100,000. All right. So, and that's in the paper itself, the Stowe et al. Paper. And then if you go over to the other measure, which was from the same population but different group, this is 1.34 versus 9.96.
So it's like 8 times higher.
Yeah. And obviously, Pfizer is showing, you can see that Pfizer is showing more modest, but still substantially higher. Now, ideally, you would want to look at the confounding factors, and you'd want to make sure that this is not a spurious association. But they don't provide the raw data, and they claim they're doing it to protect privacy, but they could easily provide de-identified
Exactly.
data to us. So they said that the raw study data are protected and are not freely available due to privacy laws, but de-identified data would have overcome that legal restriction. So let's see. Then we talked about, the second misconception, COVID-19 vaccine-induced myocarditis, usually mild and transient. Now, this is not an easy one to answer, actually, because, it does present in a mild transient way, often outwardly. And so that's a very important point. And one of our co-authors, Kirk Milhone, who's a pediatric cardiologist, who has spoken about this paper already publicly, talked about this issue and helped frame this more carefully. So we do recognize that the majority of vaccine-associated myocarditis will show up mildly in its overt clinical presentation, often resolving, in about half the cases within 90 days. But the problem is that even with mild symptoms, and this is the key quote here, can you see this pretty clearly, Nick, on your end? Okay.
Yes.
Even with mild symptoms, the underlying physiological effects and anatomical scarring, which can be microscarring too, as you recently reported on your Substack, may be more severe or potentially lethal in the long term. And myocarditis may eventually develop into congestive heart failure, dilated cardiomyopathy, cardiogenic shock with severe reduction in cardiac output leading to systemic hypoperfusion and organ failure, and in some cases, sudden cardiac death. That last part's very important for people to keep in mind, because sudden cardiac death has been a major problem among athletes, and something that has increased dramatically in the last 4 years. So I think people really often hear sudden death, and they don't realize that it can actually be originally connected to the myocarditis that those people experienced. So, which is another complication of the data, is that you can have sudden cardiac death that originally stemmed from a myocarditis case, and yet it won't be counted among the fatal myocarditis cases. Because you'd have to go back in time and make that connection. So let's see here. I think we're getting close. Okay, here we go. Do you want to say anything more about the mild versus severe, Nick, before we go on to the third one?
Yeah, so it appears that, and many people will go asymptomatic, right? It'll appear mild, but in reality, many of them will be facing permanent heart damage, permanent scarring, permanent micro scarring, many of which will not be detectable with conventional imaging. And so they won't know really anything has gone wrong until they have that moment of post or of high intensity exercise, or in the early morning waking hours of sleep, if there's a surge in catecholamines and they've reached a certain critical mass, and then all of a sudden, they're going to drop dead from sudden cardiac arrest. And we actually have a paper on that. Dr. McCullough is the first author. I'm the second author. In the World Journal of Cardiology, where we outline the mechanisms of this COVID vaccine-induced cardiac arrest, and it does start with that scarring from myocarditis. And so, if you and you do have right, there are some studies included in this study here that show there's long-term cardiac abnormalities, right?
Right.
In a large portion of these myocarditis patients.
That's right. We document that very well. So I think it provides a very solid foundation for arguing that, you know, that the assumption that the mild initial presentation translates into a mild outcome that's the wrong assumption, you know, and
Right.
in a large percentage of cases. And the media got away with this over and over again because they kept saying, it's only mild, don't worry about it. Well, it was in its clinical presentation for many people. It was mild in its initial clinical presentation. But here's an interesting point, which I'm looking into very carefully. And I think this is something that can help us understand too. The viral myocarditis, which is what people have known about with respect to myocarditis for quite some time. Viruses have caused and triggered myocarditis. For decades, we've known this. So that was the assumption coming into this pandemic, that there would be coronavirus-related myocarditis, and there were cases documented before the vaccines came out. They were relatively rare, and then after the vaccines came out and people kept getting COVID in addition to myocarditis, what often happened was that the COVID was the cause of the myocarditis. But as you and I both know, we now have good data showing that the spike protein will persist in its generation, in its propagation, for at least 700 days. And so that close to 2 years, right? Approximately. So if that's
We actually found it now. We have a case report. We're almost finished with. We found it 3 years. 3 years after the shot.
okay, so you have that background of spike protein production that is persisting for that long, and then you add the insult to injury. Okay, that is the coronavirus infection, which then gets scapegoated as the cause of the myocarditis. Okay, so that the background effect is already, you've already created subclinical myocarditis. Then the severe myocarditis triggered by the infection is misattributed to the infection. And this is a very important thing, because I think this is yet another example. We allude to it briefly in this paper, but I'm working on a paper right now that explains this more fully, that this actually is a superimposition of the infection on top of the background of pre-existing chronic spike, generation that's already damaged the heart and already set people up for arrhythmias and other kinds of problems. So that's why I say this is such a complex discussion, and often, we're talking like peeling the layers of the onion back, to understand what's going on. So the third misconception: risk-benefit analysis favor the COVID mRNA shots, or so-called vaccines. Now, this is a very interesting discussion from a scientific or policy point of view, because most of the risk-benefit analysis do conclude that the vaccines were helpful. But if you look at them more carefully, you realize, number one, they're riddled with conflicts of interest, and they're just, a huge number of basically government-sanctioned risk-benefit analyses that are based on simulated populations. They're based on modeling that is completely fallacious, because whatever you put into the model is what you're putting it in to generate a certain outcome that is going to be favorable toward the vaccines. And so I think this discussion, is, again, it's a whole discussion in and of itself, but let's see, what did I highlight here? Of course, we have already shown in the observational studies that young males are disproportionately adversely affected. Public health authorities have commonly asserted that the risk of cardiac complications is higher among individuals infected with SARS-CoV-2 than among those receiving the COVID mRNA vaccines. And so we talk about now. Go ahead, Nick. Yeah.
Oh no, I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying, this is one of those nice figures here.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Tell us, what does this figure show?
Yeah. So, oops, gotta be careful there. All right, is that clear? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have the injection on the left, the vaccine-related mRNA risk of myocarditis being approximately 2.20%, which is really 2.2%. So that is compared to the theoretical risk of SARS-CoV-2 infection being 0.06%. Now, these were from two different studies, but looking at the same age groups. Okay, so it's not a perfect risk-benefit analysis, but it is clearly concerning and does not, I think if we were to do this as part of a very careful study, we would have the same big population with the same demographics, and we would, control for all the confounders. But, I think you actually constructed this diagram. You did a fantastic job showing the outcomes. And so, as Dr. McCullough has repeatedly said, any benefit attributed to the vaccines in terms of reducing the severe outcomes has been completely speculative, has been theoretical, and it's not based on good data.
Right, and with the injections, it's actual risk, right? It's not just theoretical.
Yeah, right. Because you don't actually have any data showing direct infection-related spike in the heart or the virus in the heart with these. Most of these autopsies are only showing indirect evidence that it could be related, whereas with the vaccine, it's direct.
Right.
And so you're right. It's and the prospective studies that we described in this paper resulted in an actual risk of myocarditis in the younger people who received the vaccines at about 2.2%. That was the Thai study. When you combine it with the Bergen study, it was probably closer to 2.5% when you combine those two. That was a study from Switzerland. Those are prospective studies that are looking at cardiac function. Oop, I got to reduce this down again. That are looking at cardiac function over time, and so those were excellent studies. I do want to call attention to two risk-benefit analyses that we did heavily favor in our paper, and that is the paper spearheaded by Paul Borden of the University of Virginia, who reanalyzed the FDA's benefit risk assessment of Moderna's shot, focusing on males who are aged 18 to 25 years, utilizing data available up to the third week of January 2022. Now, the FDA relied on these data heavily for two of their risk-benefit analyses, and Borden did an incredible job taking that apart. His paper, I think, is still in press. It hasn't been published yet, but there was a preprint out. And I used that and had many exchanges with Dr. Borden. He's a brilliant researcher, and he was actually very helpful in helping me formulate a better understanding of not just the risk benefit aspect, but many of the flaws in the studies. He's really a superb scientist. So I just want to read this one part. I don't know how much more time we have, but do I have a moment to read this?
Yes. Oh yeah, we have time.
All right. When comparing their projections with the FDA's most likely scenario, the benefit-risk ratio projected by Borden et al. Was 0.67, 60 times lower than the FDA's estimate of 43.33. So the author's reanalysis suggests that over the FDA's assumed 5-month vaccination protection period, the Moderna shots resulted in 16% to 63% more hospitalizations attributable to myocarditis or pericarditis than hospitalizations prevented due to COVID-19. So up to 63% more hospitalizations linked with the vaccine-induced myocarditis than the COVID infections in terms of hospitalizations. And that and he did. I mean, if you go through his paper, it is it's a stunning indictment, actually, of the FDA's risk-benefit process. So the FDA's underestimation of risk may have been due in part to the agency's reliance on a small internal data set of 21 second-dose mRNA vaccine-related myocarditis events to estimate the Moderna-associated risk, disregarding findings from international regulatory agencies, the VSD, and some of the earlier, that's the Vaccine Safety Database, and some of the earlier large-scale observational studies that we presented in Table 1. So those were, the table where we presented the severe risk to the younger men in particular. And then Allison Krug, also, who happens to be here in Virginia, where I live. I don't know. Seems like the Virginians are really powerful these days. Allison Krug identified a total of 253 cases of myopericarditis, with 129 cases occurring after the first COVID mRNA dose and 124 after the second dose, of which 87% required hospitalization. And then she did her team did a very comprehensive analysis. And the 5 key findings were: overall, the risk of myopericarditis following the second mRNA shot exceeded the risk of COVID hospitalization during the Delta variant after the first dose. During Omicron, the additional benefit of the second dose was minimal due to reduced vaccine effectiveness against hospitalization. The analysis provided grounds for discouraging COVID vaccination in boys aged 12 to 17 with a history of prior infection. So in other words, if they had prior infection, they had more immunity, and there was less grounds for needing the vaccination, even though that need was just theoretical. And for girls, with or without comorbidities, 2 doses were not beneficial if there was a history if there was a previous exposure or history of COVID infection. And in some estimates, even a single dose was not advantageous for girls in this age group without comorbidities after prior infection. So this is all based on very conservative data, but again, not showing anything favorable for younger age groups. And I mentioned the Bardosh study. That was a university study. They did a risk benefit. It's worth looking at that. And then, let's see.
Let's check out that one figure that shows all the myths combined.
All right.
Let's move to this. Let's zoom into that. And
All right.
so, kind of in closing, because we're past the time, but
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
this is so important.
Right.
Just as a nice overview of what we just talked about.
Right.
So tell us about this figure.
Okay. First of all, this figure was wonderfully constructed by someone someone doing this interview. Uh, Thank you, Nick, for this wonderful figure. Yeah, so the misconceptions are summarized to the lower right, and we also show the risk. And I think the risks that you summarized really from our own paper, which are that there's 84 to 96% of, and this is to the lower left here, of the mRNA related myocarditis cases required hospitalization. That's fairly stunning, and that was based on multiple studies. We got that range. And then over 50% showed long-term myocardial abnormalities. So, as you mentioned before, it's those long-term effects that we're really concerned about, and that helped dispel the myth that it was, a mild transient condition. So over 50% showed long-term abnormalities in the myocardium, and then 10 to 20% fatality rate when you look at the long-term outcomes. That's just stunning to think about, that there was that level, or has been, and probably continues to be, ongoing death caused by the damage to the heart.
Right. So it's throwing a majority in the hospital. More than half have persistent myocardial abnormalities, heart damage, and 10 to 20% approximately die from it. And so, yeah, that's
Unbelievable.
bad. That's
It's
bad.
so it's so shocking that the fact that these are still on the market is mind-boggling. I mean, it's just simply mind-boggling. The agencies had the signal back in 2021, and it's 2025, and we have this kind of data, and it doesn't make any sense at all. It's a crime. It's an outright crime.
It really doesn't make any sense.
Yeah,
It really doesn't. And as lastly, go over the bottom right panel
right,
here, just
right.
to give a brief recap of
Recap.
what we just debunked.
Right. So the three misconceptions or myths. Uh, Myth number one: infection. The coronavirus infection causes more myocarditis than the shots. And in fact, no. We showed that the modified mRNA shots posed a higher risk, and were causing more myocarditis, or were associated with more myocarditis and more likely causing it. Myth number two: the modified mRNA related myocarditis is mild, or as we said, mild and transient. And in fact, the long term damage and death have been well documented. So we dispense with that one. And myth number three: the risk benefit ratio or calculus favors the modified mRNA shots. And in fact, we showed that there's strong evidence contradicting this claim.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
So, wow. Well, Dr. Mead, it's such an impressive paper. It's got so much stuff, and look, it's been an hour, and we only really scratched just the surface of key points. That's how big this paper is. So again, I want to urge everybody watching, please check out the study, read it for yourself. Any regulators watching this, please read it. It's very important, and it's non-biased information, right? There's no funding by pharmaceutical companies here. And so, Dr. Mead, is there anything you want to tell the audience in closing today? Any message? And where can people find you or follow your work?
Well, you can find me on X, and I am a McCullough Foundation scholar as well. I'm connected through the foundation to various activities, but mainly I'm on X right now. I don't have a website up of my own at this point. I don't have a Substack going, but I may at some point. And then I just want to say that in terms of a closing statement, I really encourage people to look at the highlights from the U.S. Senate hearing on the corruption of science and federal health agencies, because this paper came out a couple of weeks or a few weeks before that U.S. Senate hearing was announced. And so I know it provided a lot of fodder for the conversation that helped inform a lot of the conclusions around the myocarditis discussion in that hearing. And the hearing was incredibly exciting. I was there, you were there. Dr. McCullough was amazing. He was just so compelling in his arguments and his responses, especially to Senator Blumenthal and also to Josh Green from Hawaii, the governor. So Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut. And I thought that the whole hearing was an inspiring testimony to the emerging freedom of scientific discourse that has been suppressed for the past 5 years, which has been so sad and tragic, really, for a free society to witness. But scientists have been censored, ostracized, and many have lost their jobs because they spoke out. And so it was just a really exciting event. I encourage people to look at it.
Yes, that was an absolute fantastic moment in our fight against the mRNA shots, and it really did bring it mainstream. It was covered by a lot of platforms, and so that was key. Absolutely awesome. So please everybody go check out those highlights. Please follow Dr. Mead on X, and please check out the paper. And I want to thank everybody for your time for watching this today, and we'll see you next time.